Castles are our most dramatic landmarks from the Middle Ages, built as monuments to domination and power. Scattered all over the Irish landscape, these ancient buildings with their soaring walls and great towers leave you in no doubt about their military and defensive purpose. I just hope we brought a ladder. The Anglo-Norman aristocrats who invaded Ireland in the 12th century built their castles to control and intimidate the unruly Irish. As English rule was consolidated, the castles served as administrative centres, garrisons and jails, as well as lavish homes for the English lords. In this series, I'll be telling you stories about dramatic sieges, bloody battles, lavish lifestyles, ghostly presences, warring families, and feudal lords. After all, the history of Irish castles is the history of Ireland itself. The Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169 had been swift and effective. Within 2 years, the majority of the Irish chieftains had submitted, in the short term anyway, to Henry II, their new ruler. All along the east coast in key locations around Dublin, they began their regime of castle building. This area, known as the Pale, would be the base from which they hoped to conquer the whole island. Many of these early castles were built by individual knights whose loyalty was always a concern for a king based in London. What Henry II now needed was a network of castles that he could control. And who better to oversee this important building scheme than his son, John? King Henry made his son, John, Lord of Ireland, sending him over here to bring them all to heel. And John spent 6 months in Ireland, establishing castles in the name of the Crown at Carrickfergus, Limerick, Trim and Dublin, which was to become the centre of English rule in Ireland, home to the King's representative, who would be his eyes and ears, and of course his fist and his boot. Strongbow had shown that Ireland was rich pickings for an ambitious knight. With success came the possibility of independence, of being granted enough property to become at least a very minor lord, the ruler of a wealthy clan. Ireland was the land of opportunity, and the Anglo-Norman knight was a force to be reckoned with. Knights were the ultimate fighting machines. Trained from childhood, they were expert archers. They could ride horses, and they could sword fight. You really didn't want to pick a fight with a knight.
Very fit, hugely fit, probably quite muscular. They would have trained to be knights from very small, maybe 4 or 5. They would have started their training then. So they have huge upper body strength.
You have the Crusades happening in the Middle East at the time. Cavalrymen, and especially the lords, are seen as an elite because it's not just about hopping on a horse and going to battle. It requires a lot of skill and a lot of training.
So they were the ultimate fighting machine of medieval Europe. What would they be? Like gladiators almost.
And when these gladiators defeated an Irish lord, they built huge castles to control their lands. Ireland was about to experience its first building boom. And back in the 13th century, the same 3 rules apply as today. It's all about location, location, location.
So these guys are looking at the local topography and they're picking really good sites.
Basically, administration is growing. Lords want more officials working for them. They need to be housed. So castles become more complex residentially, defensively, and in terms of display.
Much of the time, they just muscled in on sites already built on by the Irish lords or Vikings. But there were an awful lot of clans out there, and you didn't want to have to fight them all. So Plan B, or Boy Meets Gale, gave them a sweeter way into the local scene. The Irish had always been marrying their daughters off to attractive invaders as a way of getting some political protection. And with these marriages, great dynasties were established.
So an Irish king might have several wives and he might have dozens of children. So it's fairly easy for him to arrange lots of marriages with these new incomers, and then they they create family links. And it's quite interesting because it's quite difficult for the Irish to go to war against their sister.
One dynasty that established a strong power base in the Pale was the Luttrell family. By the banks of the River Liffey, and not far from the village of Lucan, lies the beautiful Luttrellstown Castle. Now, the castle was built in the 13th century by the Luttrells, who were another Anglo-Norman family, who'd been given the land as a reward for their loyalty to King John. Now, the Irish Luttrells, well, you know what, they were a mixed bunch. I mean, the early lords were honourably involved in the Irish Catholic cause, but later there's tales of treachery, court-martials, assassination attempts. And of course, that's all long before Posh and Becks arrived to get married here with their pretend thrones.
The plan may be Beckham and Adams, but the outcome on Sunday may be Barnum and Bailey when the media circus descends on tranquil Luttrellstown. An army of British security heavies have taken over the grounds, and they don't like cameras.
We don't want to be on film, and we don't want the gates on film either.
Back in 1999, the wedding of Posh and Becks put Luttrellstown Castle on the map. The world's paparazzi all wanted to get inside the walls for a snap of the famous couple. Now privately owned, Paddy Smith is the caretaker and has worked on the estate since he was a boy.
How are you, Paddy? How are you doing, Simon?
You're like the Lord of the Manor.
Well, you're very welcome.
And you literally put out the red carpet for us, Paddy.
A red carpet for you.
Look at the ceiling.
Magnificent, isn't it?
Yeah. I'd say it's a bugger to clean, Paddy.
I've never had to do it, and hopefully I'll never be asked. You know, I love the place and I love working here, but there's some little jobs that I wouldn't have to refuse.
And there's a beautiful portrait of Mr. Bean himself, Rowan Atkinson.
King Charles II.
Is that who it is? Do we know why he's up there?
I don't know why he's up there. Obviously somebody fancied him and, you know.
It's not a very butch pose, is it?
It's not, no. Great hairdo, wasn't it?
That was a wig, Paddy. But the wedding didn't take place in the lavish house. Instead, Posh and Becks chose a ruin. It's a beautiful setting,
isn't it? Wonderful structure, all the...
So this was, back in the day, a gate lodge of some description.
It was a gate lodge, originally built as part of the garden. It was, you know, it was fashionable about 300 years ago to have a hermit minding your woods.
Right.
And that was built for him to be here and check anybody that's, you know, keep an eye on what was happening down here. And it was lived in up until 1931.
This was?
This was, yeah. And it's built as a feature, but at the same time, it was a security hut, if you know what I mean.
This is actually where the magic happens.
You know, this is where the big ceremony took place, right in that little room over there.
They got married in that room?
They got married in that. There was 24 guests themselves.
Is that all?
That's all, yeah. And
How did they get up there?
They made an artificial stairs, just, you know, and covered it and designed it with flowers and apples and oranges and all sorts to sort of make it look really well.
Have a look.
I can just imagine David saying, "Come on, Victoria.
Come on, darling.
Mind your heels, Vicky. Where's my mother? She's still in the car. I've got a great idea, Vicky.
We'll get married in here. Look at this, Paddy.
Now, this is where the ceremony took place. That was the altar right there.
Here?
Yeah. And that's where they took their vows. And this, along here, there was 24 guests.
Ah, David.
And it was all...
Take you, Victoria.
Drapes and...
So it was all kitted out,
all
obviously.
kitted out and lit, you know.
But what springs to mind is, right, they're internationally, you know, famous footballer and a rock star wife. How did they end up here in a gate lodge?
Well, they would have had an agent looking for somewhere very, very...
Special?
Special and secluded, you know, I mean, no one would find you in here.
It is special,
you know, traffic, none, helicopters couldn't find it, you know, secure, safe.
So they couldn't take the photographs, you say?
Yeah.
And it's also incredible to think, putting the Beckhams to one side, somebody lived in here until 1931.
1931, can you imagine that out there as this is your sitting room, looking at a stream flowing under your sitting room.
So Gary Neville would have stood about here, or here, really.
All right, David, go on, mate.
On you go.
Shut up, Gary. You all right, Vicky?
Yeah, great. I can see it all. It was a great day, apparently, and the plan worked. No photographer got a shot of the wedding itself. 800 years ago, a good marriage could also make a powerful alliance. And the rewards for being a sporting hero were pretty lucrative too. The Posh and Becks of the 13th century were William Marshal and Isabel de Clare, who was the daughter of Strongbow and Aoife. Now, Mareschal, well, he was described as the greatest knight that ever lived. He was a crusader. He was a jousting champion and a brilliant tactician. In fact, he was to bring so much glory to King Richard I that he was to be rewarded with a wealthy bride. When William waltzed Isabel up the aisle in 1189, both her parents were dead, and she had just inherited a huge estate in both Wales and Leinster. He was a landless sports hero, and she was a wealthy heiress. And together, they were to become a powerful match.
They got married. He was at least 20 years older than her. She was only 17 or 18. They got married in London, and it seems to have been a love match.
And William Marshal had in fact unhorsed Richard the Lionheart in a jousting bout.
Insofar that part of Marshal's fame was his jousting ability, so his sporting ability, his bravery in the tournaments was the making of him as a young man. So he comes across as one hell of a person in terms of his military ability, his administrative ability, and also his integrity.
And she knew she had done well in the man that she'd married, because Marshal was a very energetic character. He seemed to be a very robust physical man, with a background in the military arts and so on. But he also seemed to have had a very good head for business, for politics, for administration. So all in all, a good catch.
If you're peopling castles, somebody like William Marshal, basically in the parlance of my children, was a good guy.
William Marshal was the greatest knight that ever lived. And with his marriage to Isabel de Clare, he married into a mighty and symbolic lineage. They tied the knot in London with due pomp and ceremony before crossing the Channel for Ireland. On their arrival, the annals refer to Isabel establishing a lovely city on the banks of the Barrow, transforming Old Ross into New Ross, before later moving the capital of Leinster to its new base in Kilkenny. No couple would change the landscape of Ireland more than Isabel and Marshal.
Well, they established a power base in Kilkenny. They started building the castle there. They're both credited with that. I mean, a lot of the time, an heiress would marry and then would be very concerned with homely duties, with the children especially, so they kind of drop out. But Isabel seems different.
Marshal had spent 2 years on the Crusades in the Holy Land, and the castle-building technologies that he used in Ireland were probably learned there. Kilkenny Castle would be their most lasting monument.
In the history of William Marshal, which is the great poem about them, William Marshal explicitly says at one point, "I claim everything through her," to his knights. So she's a living link to him, to the great strongbow, to this tradition of kind of strong men who governed well.
With its curtain wall and 4 towers, the castle resembled the royal castles of Dublin and Limerick. And the couple weren't just responsible for the impressive castle, they rebuilt the city, its walls protecting the merchants of the new Norman town, as well as paying for abbeys and churches around the southeast.
They seem to be operating to the same game plan as a couple. And Isabella, no doubt, would have had a strong notion of herself. I mean, after all, she's the granddaughter of the King of Leinster, with a lineage going back 1,000 years, you know.
There's a very famous incident with Isabel. She was besieged in a castle in Kilkenny when her husband had to go back to England, and she very successfully held off the besiegers while very heavily pregnant. She lowered a man down the battlements to go and get help at great personal risk to herself and the men inside, and he brought back her allies and they lifted the siege. And afterwards, it's described, she took hostages from all the men involved and was quite severe in her punishments of them. And when her husband came back, he overturned many of her punishments, and she's noted in the poem as being quite displeased about it, that she felt they needed to be punished.
But you gotta hand it to them. It's a pretty impressive castle that wasn't just used to house soldiers. You can actually imagine living in it.
So he came over here and it wasn't a bed of roses.
Mareschal wasn't part of the original invasion, and the other knights apparently weren't delighted to see him.
They had a rough time when they came over here because they weren't welcomed by the older Anglo-Normans who had been here for some time. But they were tough nuts. She was a tough, feisty lady, and he was a tough knight.
So, from what we can see as we stand here today,
Yes.
what can we see that Mareschal built?
He built this great circular tower,
The keep.
which is basically the keep, the West Tower, the North Tower, and there was another tower here. And those towers were linked by what we call a curtain wall. The wall on this side of the castle was taken down in the 18th century.
Okay.
And the people who lived in the castle at that time, the butlers, they wanted a clear view out to the park.
Well, in fairness, yeah, look at the
Okay.
view. I mean, yeah.
Now you have to remember there was an outer courtyard to the castle
Right.
that's underneath the park.
Right.
All that was just swept away to lay out this lovely park.
So they could get a better view.
Exactly. And it just gives you an impression of the kind of wealth that he had access to.
What was his relationship like with the people in the town?
Well, he brought over people when he laid out his new town, known as High Town or the English town. He brought over people from England, and he brought over Flemish people, Dutch-speaking people. And they had their own town over on the other side of the castle, okay?
Right.
So you're dealing with a lot of a fairly multicultural grouping.
But for all the fine architecture, William Marshal built his castle first and foremost as a defensive structure.
The big thick walls. This is where the lads defended the castle.
This circular room is surrounded by all these little niches. And these gave access to the plunging arrow loops that defended the castle. Yes.
The boys would be sitting. The sentries have a spot each.
Sentries sat into these.
Okay. So I can see from here now. I've got a great view of
Out to the moat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now this is called a plunging arrow loop. It was state-of-the-art type of defensive ope.
So the archer can stand up.
Exactly.
And he can get someone coming up to the gate, or you can also go down there.
Yes.
So you really are snookered if you're caught on that moat.
You're caught out there. You're in a dead zone. Okay.
So they would have sat here for hours.
They would have.
Bored.
Guarding.
Distraction.
Board, as guard duty usually is,
Yeah.
until something happens. Then the action starts.
And when something happened, something really happened, didn't it?
Exactly.
You fought a lot. I mean, if you wanted to see action, you could come to Ireland. You know, you would have... People did engage in battle. You would be raided by a neighbour, whether they were Irish or Anglo-Norman, and you would get your own back. And you would go and fight them and often come off the worse for it.
All the Anglo-Norman castles were fortresses, and they were built on strategic positions so that they could control and dominate their newly acquired territories, and none more dramatically than Dunamaise. It could be seen for miles, so any soldiers that were garrisoned there had total control over the surrounding countryside. And when Isabel, the daughter of Strongbow and Aoife, married William Marshal, Dunamaise was part of her dowry. So Dunamaise passed from the kings of Leinster to the de Clares and on to the Marshals.
Dunamaise was the seat of power of the kings of Laois. This site was then seized by William Marshal as part of his inheritance when he married the daughter of Strongbow, and the site was fortified by him. This would have been one of the important Irish lordships that he needed to nail down.
The thing that's interesting about William Marshal, when we look at his castles at Kilkenny and his rebuilding of places like Dunamaise, you can see that Marshal is bringing in the newest ideas in castle design.
Overlooking the surrounding landscape, Dunamaise was a formidable fortress. The huge structure included a great hall on the top of the peak, protected on three sides by steep cliffs. It would have been some job to make it to the top. The only accessible side was protected by a double layer of defensive walls, each with its own barbican or fortified gateway, both with their own murder holes and other clever tricks, and everything guarded by the archers up on the encircling curtain walls.
So basically then, if you've managed by a stroke of luck to get through the outer bailey, across that ditch and the drawbridge, under the murder hole, past the two levels of archers that are here,
yeah,
You've then got to here, and
Yes.
then I'd imagine you're greeted by more archers.
Yes, you've got to imagine that this is a square-fronted gatehouse.
Right.
First of all, there are arrow loops firing in on either side.
So there would have been archers either side.
Here we have a portcullis slot, which is the sliding sort of grill. So basically, people on the inside can poke spears through and at anybody on the outside. Then as we walk back, then we have 2 arrow loops. I like these 2 because they're not directly opposite each other, so that the man who's in that chamber there doesn't accidentally shoot the man in the opposite chamber.
Very clever design. And we're still not there yet.
No, we've still got to get up to the top there, the hall.
Right, off we go.
As far as I'm concerned, it's martial work dating to about 1210. You see this movement that we see right across Europe from, relatively simple castles before about 1200 to much more complex castles in terms of their defence, in terms of display after about 1200. So to me, as an archaeologist, that would be my feeling, that William Marshal was at the forefront of castle design in you could say in Western Europe, and he brought many of those ideas to Ireland.
Strategically looking out here, Brian, it's so easy to see why they picked here.
So castles were being built, for defence as homes, but also for display. But we also seem to have, certainly in the 13th century, some sort of designed landscape around places like Dunamace. So it's also telling you something about the power and wealth of the castle owner.
While Dunamace seemed to be impregnable, by the mid-14th century it had been abandoned. Quite why remains a mystery. Its brooding silhouette above the lowlands of Laois make it one of the most romantic historic sites in the country.
Both Isabella and William Marshal seem to have been a very effective couple. And I think she knew she had done well in the man that she'd married.
Marshal served 4 successive kings as Lord Marshal of England, and when he died aged 72, he was not only Earl of Pembroke and the Lord of Leinster, he was also the richest man in the British Isles. He and Isabel had 5 boys and 5 girls, but the 5 boys all died childless. Now, some people say it was because of a curse placed on them by the Bishop of Ferns, so the Marshal name died out. However, as successor to Strongbow and Aoife, William arguably did more to establish Anglo-Norman control in Leinster than any other man. When the Anglo-Normans arrived, they quickly established themselves along the east coast before moving out around the country. Their secret weapon was the knight, powerful, well-trained and hopefully loyal subject who would conquer and hold lands on behalf of the king.
And of course the Normans, they captured England before they ever got to Ireland. So I mean, these guys were extraordinarily effective as military adventurers, but also making a go of the lands that they had captured.
And boy, did they have a lot of land. The Anglo-Normans were past masters at invasions.
Well, the Anglo-Normans, basically, what their idea was to come in, take over what had been the local power structure and replace it with their own.
They just simply exchanged one master for another one.
In that way, there was no great difference for the Irish. They were still paying the taxes.
All these changes were very dramatic for the kings and high kings of Ireland, but for the ordinary, decent Joe Soap, it was just a case of same old tune, just a different piper. You know, you needed a licence from the king to build walls with crenellations in it like this, because that's what they are, apparently. So not just anybody could have aspirations to live in a castle. Oh, no.
The only way you could really take out these castles was by siege. And as we know, the Irish weren't that good at siege warfare. You know, the hit and run, guerrilla war, the cattle raid, that really was where the Irish were best able.
So you've got to say to yourself, well then, okay, well how were the Irish maintaining a certain degree, depending on the area, of independence. That's one question that comes to mind, and it would be my feeling that instead of using fixed defence, they tended to abandon their centres, move off and use the landscape as a means of stopping attack from the outside. And they did that very, very successfully, not just in the late 12th century, 13th century, but right down to the 17th century. So you actually use your landscape, the landscape of your territory, against an invading force. And it can be, and in my opinion, they did it very successfully.
Although the Irish didn't build castles, they weren't without their defensive strategies. In fact, the Irish were to develop possibly the only way to defeat a Norman knight: channeling. Using the geography of the land to their advantage, they would channel the English into what we would now call a kill zone. And you can only imagine what happened in there. It was a technique that the Irish were to use successfully for hundreds of years.
They never had enough equipment to defeat an invading force with the Anglo-Normans. So what they would do is they would create barriers, either use trenches or they would use undergrowth and build up walls of impenetrable undergrowth. So the invading force were being brought into an area that the Irish wanted them to fight in. And once that happened, then they had the advantage because they knew the area. But by channeling the enemy into what they call nowadays, in modern parlance, a kill zone, that allowed them to have the advantage to ambush them. It's when they have the surprise that the Irish are able to win and beat the Anglo-Normans.
In Ireland, medieval Ireland, quite a lot of the time the Anglo-Norman mode of battle wasn't suited to quite a lot of the countryside, you know. It wouldn't be suited to woodland areas and things like that. So they would often be picked off by the Irish, what were later called the wood kern. So the Irish would hide and simply just take them down as they passed. So it's small scale, you know, and it's probably over fairly fast, because if you unseat a knight, you can finish him off fairly quickly.
Ireland was just very, very difficult to capture as a whole unit. The Romans didn't come to Ireland because I think the Romans looked at the place and said, nah, we wouldn't be able to take it all. It's not worth the investment.
And maybe the Romans were right, because while the invaders had successfully captured the east of the country, vast areas were still held by the Irish chieftains, who were now beginning to get the measure of their invaders. Families like the McCarthys of Munster, one of Ireland's great medieval dynasties, would build their own castle, and it would become one of the best-known castles in the world. Approaching Blarney Castle, you can only be impressed by its towering monolith, perched on its rocky outcrop, its limestone walls, all giving this impression of a dark, foreboding building that must have been a really dank place to live in. However, this was the lordly residence of the McCarthy family, who in late medieval times fought both the Anglo-Normans and other warring natives in order to maintain their hold over the Lee Valley, right up to the end of the 17th century. And this was their lavish and stately home.
Well, it would have been quite imposing. McCarthys were the main chieftains of the Munster region, and I think I'm right in saying there were three main McCarthy branches. And we have the Musgrave McCarthys here, and they were the main chieftains of the region. To the best of my knowledge then, Blarney Castle was regarded as a very solid place for having their main fortification on top of the limestone outcrop. So that was built by Cormac the Strong.
The castle originally dates from before 1200, when a wooden structure was built on the site. About 10 years later, it was replaced by a stone fortification, the first incarnation being considerably smaller than the massive keep we see now.
I think in the early days of any of these places, there would have been quite a lot of skirmishes and quite a lot of deaths.
But forget all that history. The castle at Blarney is known worldwide for just one thing.
I mean, the story of the stone, I mean, the legend, and we have to go by legend because that's what Blarney is that the stone is either half of the stone of Scone, given by Robert the Bruce for the men of Munster producing 10,000 men to fight at the Battle of Bannockburn, or it was Jacob's pillow that was referred to in the Bible that was brought back by the Crusaders, or McCarthy saved a girl from drowning locally, and he didn't know it, but she was a witch. And she was a friendly witch, and he saved her life. And she said, there's a stone up there that whoever touches it, I think it was touching actually in those days, rather than kissing, will always be blessed.
For 200 years now, all sorts of people have climbed to the ramparts to kiss the fabled slab of bluestone.
Well, we're going up the right-handed spiral stone staircase, which, as you mentioned, you're familiar with. Every sort of seventh step is slightly different measurement, so that if you were running down, you'd trip.
The great and good have been up these stairs, haven't they, Charles?
Quite a few, including Laurel and Hardy.
Really?
And my memory's a bit bad, but one of them made it and one of them didn't. But
I'm going to guess which one
would.
I'm going to say Ollie stayed down there. Says, Dan, you go ahead, kid. I'll wait down here and have an ice cream.
Bloody hell, what a lot of steps.
You know something?
Level.
I'm starting to feel an affinity with Oliver Hardy. I can sort of see why you wanted to stay down there. How many steps are there, Charles?
There's over 120.
How many have we done?
I'd say you're nearly there.
Right.
Well, actually, you come out and there's another interlude here where you can look down, and then you can see there's 2 floors missing.
Right.
And the roof is gone.
It's a real higgledy-piggledy bunch of rooms, though, isn't it?
Well, not the main centre, the main
But
keep
this
is-
sort of where the stairs is, and
Yes,
it
it's
shoots
wonderful.
off the staircase. And
It's wonderful.
so we've still got a few more steps to go.
Yes. And then we're upstairs.
Lead
That's
on.
the old kitchen, apparently. And I'll lead on up.
It's got considerably narrower.
Yes, it has. And the rear staircase is even narrower. So now we're on top and you get a great view.
Yeah, vertigo central. Right, so we're nearly there, at the point of it all.
We're approaching the famous stone now.
Right.
Which is embedded in the south side of the battlements, as you can see.
But I would imagine that a lot of the tourists that come over to Ireland, do they know where it is? And they say, we're going to go over and kiss the Blarney Stone, Harry. It's great. It's in a little room. And
It's amazing how many of them
And they see where it is.
It's a stone on the ground.
Really?
And they don't realise it's actually embedded up in the battlements 120 feet up.
So when they get up here, they go, oh, you know what?
And my father and his brother years ago used to tell me they'd wait under the castle for the coins to drop down. Yeah,
But nowadays you'd be catching iPads and iPhones.
You would.
Yeah, hotel keys.
When they get further back.
Yeah. Kiss.
Right. Top me up for another while.
The moment's arrived now.
You're
isn't
quite
it?
safe. But
Am I?
make sure you go down far enough because it's got to be a memorable experience. And if you really feel comfortable, open your eyes and you'll see the world upside down.
Okay, tell my kids I love them, will you?
Same again, so just sit down there.
Right.
Lay back, grab the 2 bars.
Grab the 2 bars.
This one, head back.
Okay.
Straight down for the bottom stone. And kiss. Watch your head in the way up. Alright. Thank you.
I don't know whether about seeing the world upside down. I thought I saw my lunge there for a minute.
Did you open your eyes?
I did, yeah. But
It's
that's
good, isn't it?
So the myth is that's apparently going to give me the gift of the gab.
Gift of elephants. And
Some people might say that I already have the gift of the gab.
just find that it just tops it up. So
I'm good for another few years. It's
you're
like
good for
topping up
another
your
few
phone.
years. You might have to come back in a couple of years' time.
Despite their initial successes, mostly in Leinster, the English conquerors were struggling to maintain control. Beyond the Pale, Ireland was still bandit country.
You're not wanted, essentially, quite a lot of the time. And there are raids deep into the Pale, even as late as the 15th century. So you can still be got at. It's not an us versus them. It's a lot more complex than that.
The initial period, you would have had adventurers coming to Ireland on the basis that lands were available if you could take and hold them. But as the Anglo-Norman period went on, there were less and less who appeared to be willing to come to Ireland because of the continuing enmity of the native Irish, it was regarded as a very dangerous place to go.
And no more dangerous than the north of the country, where the native clans refused to entertain the invaders on any terms. Kings of their own terrain and operating at the furthest reaches from Dublin, the clans of the north would always be uniquely independent.
When the Anglo-Normans arrived, John de Courcy did make inroads into Ulster. There's no doubt about it, but it didn't catch on. It didn't hold on, and families like the O'Neill and the O'Donnells were fiercely independent. There's plenty of references to how lawless it was. Now, when something is referred to as lawless in the English records, all that means is it's not culturally English.
In 1315, Donald O'Neill, King of Tyrone, decided to take advantage of long-standing contacts across the sea in Scotland.
The King of Northern O'Neill decided it would be a good idea to invite in Edward Bruce, the brother of the Scottish King, Robert Bruce, because the King of Scotland was doing extremely well against the English. The administration in Dublin really wasn't being held in high respect. So Bruce was invited over to become King of Ireland by the native Irish, and he pretty well devastated the country.
After defeating the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert Bruce of Scotland looked west to Ireland, knowing that opening a second front would strengthen his hand. As well as a common enemy, Ireland and Scotland had plenty of ties, and he easily gathered support from his Gaelic brothers. That May, Robert's brother Edward landed 6,000 men on the coast at Larne, before marching onto the English garrison castle at Carrickfergus. This would be the first test of the castle, and the siege would last 12 months. During the siege, there was no way out for the defending garrison, forcing them to think of clever methods to use what scarce resources they had.
What must life have been like for those 12 months inside the walls of this castle? When you know you're utterly surrounded, you're running out of food.
Yes.
You've got water, which is huge. You've got water, but that's it.
You have water, and after you've hunted down the last few vermin or cats or dogs or any mice that are there,
with more than 2 legs,
or
basically.
Any of the vegetation, whether it be weeds growing on the walls that you can eat, you start looking at your neighbours.
You're sort of sleeping with one eye open then, aren't you?
Basically.
And in terms of the soldiers that were in here at that time, I mean, right down here behind us, that's where they lived.
That's where they lived.
So there would have been wooden, houses and construction.
Wooden houses, but I suspect that most of them would have slept on the walls, because when you're under siege, you have to have one eye on the enemy the whole time in case they try and climb over the walls.
And the other eye on your pal looking at you.
The garrison could drop things on top of you, and they could drop boiling oil that would scald you. They could set you on fire.
Yeah.
And
they could shoot you with the arrows.
They could shoot you with arrows. But one of the particular things that they also did, which is very cost effective for a garrison, was to heat up sand. So it was red hot. Then they would drop it down onto you, and the red hot sand would get into your armour and would actually burn you to bits.
I mean, it's utterly brutal, but it's actually very, very clever, because you're looking for a natural resource, sand. Where will we get some sand? Down to the beach, lads.
After a 12-month standoff, the defenders of the castle offered to negotiate terms. Bruce sent in 30 troops for the talks. The garrison closed the doors behind them.
And so the food is gone. So the story goes
that they ate of their Scottish prisoners.
They ate.
That's what the story goes, and that's how desperate the garrison would have been. They would have had water, but they wouldn't have had any food. They would have eaten any animal or weed that was growing in the castle, but no food for months.
They've eaten 8 of the soldiers.
Yes.
They're down to nothing now.
The food runs out, and in September 1316, the garrison actually surrender on conditions that their lives are spared, and that appears to have happened.
They were allowed leave with their lives spared.
They were allowed to leave, but Edward Bruce stayed in Ireland until he was killed at the Battle of Falkirk in 1318, and there was lots of disruption to population and to crops. There was lots of starvation, and Ireland was left in a wrecked place after he was killed.
Although the Bruce campaign was a failure, the English realised that they didn't have the firepower to rule the whole island.
In a colonial sense, the Norman invasion failed. It didn't win over the whole island. And in fact, many of the Anglo-Norman families went over to the Gaelic side. They became Gaelicised. There's a saying for them, it's hiberniores ipsis hibernum, which is more Irish than the Irish themselves. So they became Irish, and they spoke Irish. They married Irish women. Their children were Irish, and they forgot their Anglo-Norman background.
I think the Irish fight back begins in the 13th century. It accelerates in the 14th century, partly as a consequence of the Bruce Wars. The Irish were in the ascendancy, and Irish culture, Irish language, laws and so on were expanding their area of use. So Ireland had to be effectively reconquered again.
With all to fight for, the building of castles would continue all around the country, so much so that the 15th century would see us become the most castellated country in all of Europe.